Hi, welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. I'm Charlene Jorgensen, and today I'm going to show you how to make a new variation of the log cabin, which I call Sugar and Spice. Now for many, the log cabin is the first quilt that they ever make, and it's familiar to quilters everywhere. It's a wonderful design for beginners to make because there are no bias edges and all of the sewing is straight sewing. The advanced quilter likes to work with this design because they can create so many different possibilities with color, and by rearranging the blocks around, it's unbelievable the designs that are possible. Before starting with the quilt that we're going to work on today, I want to show you a couple of the quilts in the studio. In the 300 series, we made a variation of the log cabin that had diamonds in the corners, which formed stars after all of the blocks were connected. There's always more than one way to put the blocks together, and this is no exception to that rule. The blocks in this quilt were started in the center, and from there I finished creating the design. You'll also notice that you see a red star in the center, and that was created just by color and nothing else. The blocks in this quilt are very much like, in fact, they're exactly like the traditional log cabin when you eliminate the outside edge of each of the blocks. Each block has a light and a dark part to it in a diagonal direction, and that's what creates the overall design when looking at this quilt. You'll notice that I've used plaids and stripes in this quilt, and that's what gave it the warm feeling that it has. I'd like to mention that when cutting these fabrics, I was not concerned about the straight of grain when cutting the lugs, because I actually think it adds charm to the quilt when it's completed. Like I said earlier, there are many design possibilities when working with the log cabin. Today we're going to start building the block from the corners. Many times in the past, I've told you to make sure that there is a variety of fabrics in each of the blocks. I've also told you to make sure that there's a contrast from one fabric to the next with a variety of backgrounds so that they don't mush together when you look at the quilt. I've also said to make sure that there's enough color change so that you can see one block to the next. Well, in this quilt, I've broken all of those rules, but it's the gradual change of the color that creates the overall design. That's what makes it so unique and wonderful. The path of wine squares that go through the quilt in the diagonal direction in both ways will draw your eye completely across the quilt. The squares then created a secondary design, which we sometimes refer to as cross-hatching. When you look at the outside edge of the quilt, you'll see that we have announced that it's completed with two borders. The border that is in the inside is the same width as the wine path that goes through the whole quilt. The outside border, when creating that one, we first decided on how we were going to quilt the edge. Well, when we looked at the fabrics that we were using in the quilt, we saw that there were grape leaves and grapes in one of the fabrics, and it was from that fabric that we decided to create a design on the computer, and that's how we created the stencil that was used. So it is amazing sometimes where you get some of the ideas that you're going to use. Also, I recommend before doing any quilting at all that you pre-wash all of your fabric with a soap that has no bleaching additives in it. And then, of course, you want to take the time to press all your fabric so that it lays nice and flat before cutting all of the pieces. The pattern shapes that we will be working with today are off to my right. I have put quick grips on the back sides of all of them to keep them from sliding when we're cutting, and then I have also taken the time to label them so that I can keep track of them. There are a couple of ways that you can label your templates. As you can see, I've put a little sticky tab on them with the actual letter, or you can use an opaque ink that will be permanent and it won't move around when working with the patterns. I will first cut one of the strips that goes into the or one of the logs that goes into the quilt, and I want to explain to you a couple of things about how I cut them. I prefer using pattern shapes like this to cut all of the logs because I find that the accuracy is so much better. If you use the sew before cutting method, it's sometimes hard to keep the accuracy and your block won't end up as straight when you are done. So we will be using patterns to cut all of our logs first, and then when we get to the sewing machine and start sewing, we won't have to make a trip from the sewing machine to the ironing board and to the cutting table, and we won't have to keep making that circle all the time. We will be able to stay at the sewing machine. When cutting the logs, I recommend that you cut these strips for the length of the log instead of the width, and that will help you to save fabric when you're working. And I have folded the fabric in half, matching the selvage edges over here, and then matched the folded edge with the selvage edges. So we now have 4 layers that we'll be working with. And then bifold the rest of the fabric up on top of the board so that it can travel along when you turn it around. When straightening the fabric, lay your ruler up on top of the folded fabric then and line up the edge of the ruler with the second fold that you have in the fabric. Now I prefer doing all of my cutting with a rotary cutter, and there's many kinds of cutters on the market. I guess you just need to choose one that you're comfortable working with. And many of the cutters have different safety features. Now when I open the blade on this cutter, I'm just going to push slightly with my thumb and the blade is exposed. And when I close it again, it will just be another simple touch with the thumb, and I have put it back behind the guard. There's a couple of ways that you can hold the cutter, and I'm most comfortable when I rest my pointer finger up on top. Now some like to hold the cutter like this, and I guess you just need to practice and see which one you're comfortable working with. When cutting, I have grips on the back side of the ruler also, and you'll notice that it didn't slide then when I was doing that. Close the cutter every time you're going to turn your work so that you don't cut yourself. Now I'm going to turn the fabric and the board all at one time, and allow yourself plenty of room to do that so that you don't have to disturb the fabric that you've already straightened. Now I mentioned that you need to cut the strips the length instead of the width, and we will save fabric when we do that. So lay the template up on top of the ruler and then slide the ruler over so that the edge of the template matches the straightened edge of the fabric. Also, we have the edge of the ruler over here lined up. Then make the cut along this edge of the fabric. And then you can just remove that bulk out of your way. Now that you have the strip cut, it's time to start cutting that fabric or the logs. Like I said, I prefer doing it this way because I have much more accuracy, and I don't have to keep making that trip from the sewing machine to the ironing board and make that complete circle all around all the time. Okay, now we'll have 4 logs at a time that we'll be cutting. Turn the board with the template riding on top, and we will continue to cut the logs. Now the reason I told you to cut the strips the length instead of the width is that already we would be out of fabric if we did it the other way. So just simply keep laying the template down on top until you have cut logs that you need. Now in this design, the same fabric is used for the same log 2 times in the block, and I'll show it to you up in front here. Now this particular fabric that I was just cutting was used in 2 positions, and that's true for all of the logs. We used the same fabric for all of them. And of course I'm not going to cut any more logs because you would use the same process for all of them. The arrangement of logs There's just so many possible ways that you can move these blocks around, and I'd like to show you a couple of ways before we go to the sewing machine. The design that we're working with today, well, we'll start out with a couple different ones and see if we can get to that one. This would be one way that you could put it. You'll end up with a design that looks like that, and you'll see what happens when you start moving those blocks around. You can get many different designs. We'll go like this, I guess, and then we'll do one like this. This would be one possibility that you could have. You could have going like this. Well, let's get it back in here in the center. You see how you can create many different designs by just moving the blocks around? Actually, this is the one that we will be working on today. So after you get the blocks made, if you decide to change your mind, you still have the chance to do that. And that's one of the reasons why advanced quilters like to work with this design, because there are so many design possibilities. If you aren't able to sew right away after you have all of your logs cut, I find it very helpful to store them in an envelope and then put them away. And when you're ready to sew, you just pull them out of the envelope and you'll start chain sewing. When starting to sew, I'm going to talk about the process up here a little bit before we go to the sewing machine so that you know where we're going to go with the block. We're going to start with this one in the center first, then this one will go on here, and then this one will come on here. And we'll work our way from the corner in a diagonal direction instead of working around the center. And as you can see, each time we'll add the top block and then we'll go to the side until we have the finished size that we want. Now you can make the block as large as you want. You just stop at any point that you want to. You could stop here or over here, and whatever you choose to do will be fine, I'm sure. Just get creative when you start working with these designs. Well, let's go to the sewing machine and let's see what we can do putting the blocks together. I want you to use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance when sewing all of your blocks together. And the reason I stress that over and over again is because you need to make up for the amount of fabric that you use in your seam allowance. And also I want you to use 100% cotton thread to match the fabric for strength and care. We'll be doing some chain sewing today, and before you do a lot of chain sewing, I want you to give yourself a sewing test, and I'll show you how you can do that. When starting the block, we'll be starting in the corner instead of the center, like I said, and we'll be putting the pieces right sides together. And I find it very helpful if I press the pieces together before chain sewing, because they'll stick together and they'll go through the sewing machine much nicer, and I don't have to guide them as much. I like to use an open toe foot so that I have an unobstructed view in front of my needle. And when chain sewing, of course, you don't do any back stitching, you just continue on sewing, but we first have to pass that sewing test. And after 2 of these are sewn together, if it equals the next log, you have passed that sewing test. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. If these 2 pieces sewn together equal this one, then you have passed the sewing test, and you'll be able to continue chain sewing with a lot of confidence. And that will keep your blocks straight and square, and they'll lay nice and flat. Now, one thing that I'm going to do today is I'm going to iron my seams open, and that is a very controversial thing amongst quilters. It doesn't mean that if you iron your seams to one side that you've done it wrong. I guess it's whichever way you prefer. I guess my point is that if it's okay to iron the seams on clothing open, it should be okay to do so when you're quilting. And these seams are all reinforced when you quilt 1/4 of an inch from the edge of all of the seams, and certainly it's reinforced if you do machine quilting. So I will be ironing my seams open today, and if you choose to do it the other way, that will be fine too. When I talk about chain sewing, I mean it. I just keep chain sewing, and I get a factory going, and we're just, when you really get into the block, you don't have to waste a lot of time. So I line up the fabrics, and I pick off that same pile all the time, and you save a lot of time when you do it that way. And then when you start pressing, of course, you can just keep going. When pressing all of the seams, I go through a little more effort than some might do, and I take the time to finger press all of the seams first on the wrong side and the right side, and then I press it with an iron. Now, if you keep the ironing board right close to you, you'll be more apt to do so. If you have to get up and go to the ironing board, you probably decide you can get by without doing it. The first thing you would do then would be to chain sew many of these little squares together by 2s, and then after you have that done, you start putting it into a block like this with the wine color in opposite directions. After those are sewn together, when you turn it over on the wrong side, it's going to look like this. I have ironed this seam open going this way and then crossed over there. The next part that you're going to do when putting the block together is you need to start adding to that block, and so we'll go to that part now. If you passed your sewing test, then in the beginning you place this piece on top and you'll have a perfect match. And you would get a factory going, and you would do as many of the blocks as you needed. Now, the size of this quilt is determined by the number of blocks that you make, and of course the number of rounds that you put in each block. Like I said, you can stop anywhere you want to. So you would sew this one and not any back stitching when starting out, and notice how I hold on to the thread, especially if it's the first piece that I send through. Now, if you're chain sewing, of course, you don't have to hang on to the thread behind the needle. And I checked underneath with the stiletto to make sure that the fabric was laying nice and flat. Then after you've done that, take time to finger press that seam open, and we'll cut the threads off so that we don't have those in our way. I like these seams open also because it just doesn't have all that bulk in the corners, and then when you come to quilt, it's so easy to go through all those corners. And it's really easier to do machine quilting as well. Okay, then we need to add the next piece on, which is the one up here. Nope, I did that wrong. It goes up here, like that. See how easy it is to get that block going in the wrong direction? Now we're going to put these right sides together, and we're going to stab a pin on the seam line first, and that will be the one that will hold it in place when we put the other 2 pins in. This is the technique that I use over and over so often, putting a pin on the seam line and then one on the bottom, and that holds the seam together while you put the other 2 pins in. Now, often I tell you to put a pin on both sides, but after you've done it a while, you might find that just the one on one side or the other will be enough to hold it in place. Then you'll have all of these to do, and this will complete then the first round on this block. Every time you add one fabric, and I said that the same fabric is used twice in every block, and it's the same size. Now in the traditional log cabin, the log will change, or the fabric changes each time you add the next log. And I move the pin out, remove the pin just before I get to it, and then continue on. And again, we'll take the time to chain sew, or to finger press it open, excuse me, and then go on to the next round. But see how nice that corner gets after we have it put together. Then after that one's on, you're ready to add the next round, which is up in here. The same thing will be true for that one. First add this piece on up on the top, and we'll turn it over. And it's easier if you chain sew or if you're sewing with this seam on top, and then you can make sure that your seams haven't flipped out of place or gone backwards when you're sewing. This is a fun quilt to work on. You can be watching TV at the same time. You don't have to do a lot of concentrating, especially after you get started with it. That's why the beginners like working with it. Also, all the seams are straight, no bias edges to worry about. Then you would push that seam open, just like you did the last time, and then continue to put the other side on. And I think you need to see that pinning method a couple more times so that you know how to go about it. Now you put that up to each other so that you make sure that you have it in the right place. Put them right sides together, and we'll sew with this one on the top because this one has the most seams now to cross over. And we only need to do that pinning in one place because that's the only seam that we're going to need to match. First on the top and the bottom. And this time I think we'll just use one pin on one side of the standing pin so that you know that you can get by with doing just that. And of course, if you were doing this at home, you will do many of these at the same time. You'd probably work with all of the blocks in the same round. Now just before I get to that pin, we'll pull it out, and then we'll continue on and hold that fabric down just before you get to it so it can go under real nicely. And again, no back stitching is necessary when you get to the end of the seam. We'll see now another perfect seam in the corner just by using one pin. So you see you can do it either way. The next round that you add then is up here. Now there is a lot of contrast from these two fabrics. Actually, these two mushed together quite a bit up in here, but there was contrast here. But when we start getting down into the next rounds, like from here to here, there probably isn't as much contrast. So let's put those two together next. The first one again would be to go out here. We'll put that one on. Now I said you can stop any place you want to when adding these rounds. You don't have to make it as big as I did in the quilt. This one was fun to create on the computer. I had the blocks going many different ways. It was like some of the other quilts, it was hard to choose when working with this design as to which one I wanted to use. Then after I decided on the arrangement of the blocks, that's when I started to choose the fabrics. I guess from now on I probably shouldn't make a lot of rules when I teach because it seems like the next time I do a series I'll probably break them anyway. And as your sewing skills are more advanced, you're going to be more willing to try new things, and I guess that's what probably I have been doing, is experimenting with new ideas every time I work on a new project. One more time we'll show you how to put the pin in, and we'll sew with this one on the bottom because that one doesn't have all that matching to do. We only have one seam every time we add a piece to match, and that's this one right here. So it really is a nice one for the beginners to work with. This time we'll try it again with just one pin on one side of the standing pin, and then after you get that one in, pull this one out. Again, we'll hold on to the thread behind the presser foot. Now, if you were sewing your quilt, you would choose a thread that would match the majority of the background in your fabric. I'm sewing with a white thread so that you can see where my seams are going. And just before I get to that pin, we'll pull it out, and that holds that seam line in place just long enough so that we have a perfect match. After you get then all of your blocks sewn together, that's a fun time to start arranging them in the arrangement that you want. And then of course you have the fun of choosing the borders and the stencils that you're going to use. When I come to the part of making my quilt sandwich, then I like to use a low loft batting because it drapes so nicely on the bed. And it's also nice to hand quilt when you use a low loft batting. It's just a nice way to end the quilt. Well, I sure hope you've enjoyed watching me build this variation of the log cabin together with you today.